discuss the basic steps for performing a hypothesis test. Always check the requirements for the test that you are performing. The null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis are complements. If the null is true, then the alternate is false, and vice versa. The null hypothesis basically says there is no effect. The alternate hypothesis says there is an effect. Step 3, select the level of significance, or alpha. Alpha is the false positive error rate, or the type 1 probability error rate, or the probability that the null hypothesis is rejected when it is true. 4. State the critical value or critical values of the test statistic. The critical values separate unusual values of the test statistic from usual values. The unusual values are what is known as the critical region. The critical region is always in the tails of the distribution. Step 5. Draw your sample. Calculate your standardized test statistic to serve as evidence for rejection. This will be either a T or a Z statistic from your sample. Step 6. The decision. If the test statistic is in the critical region, reject the null hypothesis. Otherwise, fail to reject the null hypothesis. Rejection means the test is positive and you're subject to a type 1 error. Fail to reject means the test is negative and you are subject to a type 2 error. Since you have not sampled the entire population, errors are possible. A type 1 error occurs when you reject the null hypothesis and it is true. This is a false positive. This is detecting an effect that is not there. In court, the null hypothesis is that the defendant is innocent. The alternate is that the defendant is guilty. A type 1 error occurs when you detect an effect that is not there, or you claim that the defendant is guilty, when in fact the defendant is innocent, or the null was true. A type 2 error occurs when you fail to reject the null hypothesis when it is false, meaning that you should have rejected it. This is missing an effect that is there. This is a false negative. In court, this means that you failed to reject the null hypothesis, which is that the defendant is innocent, when in fact you should have rejected it because the defendant is guilty. Step 7, the last step. Interpret the decision. If you reject the null hypothesis, there is enough evidence. If the claim is the null hypothesis, there is enough evidence to reject the claim. If the claim is the alternate hypothesis, there is enough evidence to support the claim. If you fail to reject the null hypothesis, there is not enough evidence. If the claim was the null, there is not enough evidence to reject the claim. If the claim was the alternate, there was not enough evidence to support the claim. And they lived happily ever after. The end.